Hello, everybody. It is Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome, and welcome back to another video over here on That's Comical. And of course, if you're watching and it happens to be a Wednesday, happy new comic book day. It's been a while since you've seen any of us on this channel. Lots has been going on everywhere. How does the thing go these days? The pop culture thing. Everything is happening everywhere, anything all at once, however it goes. Like that movie, I don't know. I fell asleep during that movie, so I have nothing better to say about it. But anyway, I'm just glad to not only be here to give you guys a brand new episode of Character Profiles, but this is actually the first time that I'm actually seeing my buddy over here, Andy, face to face in the longest of times. We briefly talked about it here on the channel, but Andy has officially joined the ranks of fatherhood, like myself. So,
Yep.
Andy, it's great to see you regardless, you know?
Yeah, I'm really glad to be able to do one of these. I'm glad to talk to you, and it is very funny realizing how long it's been since I've seen your actual face. But
Yeah,
my
it's
son is
been
doing
since
great.
it's been since I think it was it was late April when we actually stopped by to give you
Yeah,
guys some hand-me-downs.
yeah. He was born on April 9th, and you guys came. It was pretty soon afterwards. You guys came to drop that stuff off. That was you guys were lifesavers. So yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, but I'm glad that Andy is here, and I'm hoping that this will not be the last time in a while that you will see him. We'll definitely talk about some more projects in the wings, but today's a very special episode of Character Profiles because it's a very important year in the world of comics history, because today we're going to be talking about probably one of the most, if not the most, iconic comic book superhero in all of comics. He may not be as popular as he once was, but that's just because of the fact that the lexicon of superheroes has grown so much. But he was one of the first, and this year happens to be the 85th anniversary of the Man of Steel himself, Superman. So, Andy, I'm really excited to discuss this very well-known character because you don't need to be a comic book reader in this world that we're living in to know who Superman is.
No. Superman is one of those characters who is just in the DNA of pop culture. Everybody is familiar with some version of Superman. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts about the character, Steve, for us to talk a little bit about our own experiences with the character, the importance of him to American pop culture. I don't think his relevance can be overstated. So I think this is a really cool one for us to be able to do.
Yeah, it's quite amazing to believe that, as I said earlier, there's a lot of superheroes out there right now, not just from the company that Superman's from, which is DC Comics, but there's plenty in the world of Marvel, in the world of Image, and even some in the indie world. And yet, after all this time, he still managed to hold this iconic status. I mean, I know for a solid fact that these days, Batman and Spider-Man are probably more popular, even some of the X-Men. But it's like you can go to a person who has no knowledge of Superman in any of his shapes and forms and still knows that when you say, look up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, they know you're talking about Superman. When they see that famous S on the shield, they know that that's Superman.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also really crazy because of the fact that he has been around for 85 years, because in the last few years, there has been a lot of celebrating over at Marvel Comics because there has been celebrations of the anniversaries of Spider-Man, Thor, the Fantastic Four, the Incredible Hulk, the Avengers, the X-Men. But these are 60th anniversaries. And we're talking about a character that has been on the world's pop culture stage for almost a century.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the question is, he came out in 1938 in Action Comics #1. How is it that he has managed to be so relevant for all these years when, in fact, probably one of the biggest challenges when it comes to creating fictional characters is to make an all-powerful being relatable to their readers and fans?
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah, my take on this is really, I think that the longevity of Superman comes from the simplicity of the character in a sense, at least in the way it was originally conceived of, and in the way that it permeates through pop culture. I think Superman has become the quintessential superhero. Even if, as you're saying, other heroes might be more popular. Like I bet you on, I mean, any given day, I'm sure there's more sales of like a Spider-Man comic. Wolverine merchandise is selling like crazy and always has and probably always will. But there's something about the Superman character at its most base that just screams superhero. Um, I think a lot of that comes from the mythology of the genesis of the character. I think Superman is our modern day American Moses. And I think that that kind of timeless story of coming from nothing, being separated from who you were, and growing up to be something great, who's a hero to everyone in the world around you, is endlessly fascinating to people. It's a modern day campfire story. It's our closest equivalent to mythology in the year 2023 America. So while there might be other characters with more, and we'll get into writers who have done great things with the character, but I'm talking about like the kind of kernel of the Superman character, right? Like maybe there are characters who have something a little more interesting, a little bit more of a twist. Maybe there's characters who have still more ground to be explored in what is written about them. But when you think of the superhero, it's Superman. And I think that's going to be what gives the character its continued longevity and why we are where we are 85 years later.
Yeah, I mean, it's his beginnings are definitely very humble because, oh, by the way, love the cup.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I'm still
This is
using
from
mine too.
Steve. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so Superman was created at a time when the whole concept of the superhero wasn't even a thing. I mean, if you want to think about superheroes, you think about, supernatural occurrences through the acts of man in things like the Bible and fantasy stories. That's basically what you had until the comic book industry had finally decided that we want to go in this very specific direction. And it was from the minds of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, these two boys from middle America, deciding that, let's create a brand new mythos for America. Let's create this human character, because when you read the original comic, I was fortunate enough to pick up Action Comics #1, the facsimile edition, to see the original story. And I will definitely say Superman was a very unusual character then compared to what he is now today. But they definitely talked about the fact that this was an extraterrestrial being who had a secret identity, Clark Kent, and he was a reporter at the Daily Planet, and he fought crime as Superman. And it was this unbeatable force, and it basically filled the minds and imaginations of young boys, mostly at the time, because that's basically what the comics at the time were really geared towards. So these children were reading about this incredible character. And it's also really amazing because at the time, fast forward just a few years later, there really weren't that many superheroes. I mean, you had Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, and then of course you had the JSA mostly in DC, and even Marvel Comics, which wasn't called Marvel at the time, had their own superheroes, but there weren't that many. I mean, the biggest name in Marvel at the time was Captain America in World War II. It's just amazing to see that what made Superman so special was the fact that he seemed to stand above the rest. And at the time, there were other means of getting this character out there after he was conceived in the pages of the comic books, because you had the radio shows. And it was actually one of the interesting fun facts about Superman is when he was first created for the comics, he didn't fly. It wasn't until I believe it was the Max Fleischer cartoons of the 1950s when they gave him the ability to fly. And then, of course, you had the George Reeves television show. So Superman, I think what was so interesting was because of what he was, he evolved quicker than the other superheroes that were out there. I mean, I knew that Batman had a fan base as well, but it was also a very different time because you're thinking about the fact that this is post World War II, and then when you head into the 50s, you have the Korean War. And so you think about heroes like Captain America and Superman, but mostly Superman because of his powers, even though, Captain America has powers too, but not like Superman. And I just feel that because of the fact that Superman was what he was, he evolved and became an icon much quicker within that small fraction of time.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think the superpowers of Superman, the unbeatable character, is a major reason why the character took hold in the first place when you think about the target demographic at the time. We can talk a little bit more, as I'm sure we will, about stories that are written about Superman, especially more modern ones. But I'm sure you have heard this kind of thing all the time, Steve, and I'm sure anyone watching this has too. There's a certain kind of tone that comes up, I think, when people first get into comics, of finding something about Superman rather passé, because the pop culture conception of Superman is that original version of Superman. The no flaws, no faults, all powerful, never loses, godlike being, right? And that can read to someone who does not know great Superman stories as very boring. And you can understand why Batman has become more popular. People who are comic book fans like talk about Batman comics, that kind of thing when comparing DC a little bit. But the thing is, that's closer to the genesis of the character. You talking about the facsimile edition of the first of Action Comics that you had read recently. I get that. I'm curious how much of the feelings about the Superman character in 2023 are based on Superman from 85 years ago, as opposed to who he is today. And there's versions of this character. Of course, it's funny you mentioned Captain America. I think there's a feeling when people get into comics of, I'm not going to like the comic about the unassailably good character whose stories are they always win. And that's not exactly who Superman is, and that's not really what his struggle is, whether he beats the bad guy or not, right? So anyway, I don't mean to go too far afield. I'm thinking more about 85 years ago right now. But I can see why there was a draw at the time, given the demographic that was being targeted and the fact that superheroes were, as you were saying, very new. But I think some of that original conception of the character lingers, even if it's not the most elegant description of what his stories are today.
Well, it's not that you were trailing off, Andy. As a matter of fact, you're going in the correct direction here because it's not just the fact that he grew to that iconic status so quickly. It was also exactly what you said. Some people would probably find what Superman is very boring. So think about what happened in the history of comic books. I mean, we head into the late 40s already, and the superhero is already blasé and passe and boring already. And the reader of comics was looking more towards the pulp comics, the crime comics, the horror comics. That's the reason why the parents caught on and said, "Why is my child reading this trash? This is bad for the kids' minds." And then the Comics Code came, and then the Silver Age of comics came, where it wasn't more fantasy driven as much as it was science fiction driven. And you had the characters like Barry Allen's Flash and Hal Jordan's Green Lantern and Aquaman. And then, of course, Stan Lee just brings Marvel Comics into the picture, and you get the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and the Avengers and the X-Men. And thanks to the Avengers, Captain America comes back after not really being in the public eye for a while because of the attitude towards comic books. And then I think within the Silver Age of comics, I feel that is where Superman, while he was still very much relevant and still very popular, I think the issue with the Silver Age of comics was because they made Superman too powerful. Because when you take a look at the science fiction driven stories, then the whole concepts of physics comes into the play. And so you see that Superman can turn back time in a planet by spinning it backwards. He can literally flick a planet out of orbit if he has a cold or something like that. So they made him very, very powerful. And we're going already into the 1970s, because in the 1970s, towards the 80s, that's when you have Christopher Reeve don the Superman outfit and give us the very first true comic book film. And I think that thanks to Richard Donner and Christopher Reeve, I think that's the reason where the people who were falling out of love with Superman were drawn back to Superman, because of the fact that you had a real life face for that character for the first time in a long time. Sure, you had the cartoons. I mean, you had the Super Friends from Hanna-Barbera. So if you want to talk about ultra powerful, ultra family friendly, ultra campy, there you go. I mean, that's why I feel that even though I understand what the comics code and the silver/bronze age was for comics, I totally understand why the direction was where it went, but I can definitely understand why it would get way too old, way too fast.
And it's interesting you say that, because I was thinking at some point I would need to say, I'm sure Christopher Reeve's Superman is the iconic version to a number of people, particularly people who don't actively read comics. I feel like that there's certainly still a segment of the population where that is the definitive take on the character for a lot of people. Certainly it's one that has had a legacy in pop culture. It's one that gets anytime there's a new Superman movie, there is something to to reference the original films. And really, you're right, kicked off the entire idea of the superhero movie. Not for nothing, with a great theme song that everyone will hum forever. But
well, that's because John Williams is also an icon himself. I mean, the fact that he's in his 90s and just scored the last Indiana Jones movie is quite a feat.
I know. What a career. But anyway, that's a semi-related topic for another day, maybe. But
yeah, you're absolutely right. But of course, then we're getting into a very important time in comics, and that was basically the great decade that is known as the 1980s. I don't care what anybody says. I feel that when it comes to creativity and just flat out letting your imagination run wild in entertainment, the 1980s was the time to do it. That was just when everybody's imaginations in the world of creativity were just running wild. But at the same time, this was also when, in the late 70s, going into the 80s, that was when there were these names that were showing up in the world of comic books that decided that we got to shed this campiness and we've got to go in a different direction, because if we keep going in this direction, we're not going to be able to not only get some new readers coming in, but we're not going to retain our loyal readers. So this is when you have the names like Chris Claremont coming in. And of course, after we got Batman, Death in the Family, we could definitely smell that there was a definite change in the wind. And you can definitely tell that Superman was a character that was in dire need of a reinvention. And think about it, the fact that if you want to talk about comics and how a great depiction is that, I don't even know if you realize this, but take a look at Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, issue number 4. What is that all about? It's a showdown between Batman and Superman almost gets beaten to death by Batman. So even though Superman will always be probably the most well-known superhero to the world, it is still amazing to know that there was a time when people were literally sick of this character and just dying for something new. And the only way to do that was to make him vulnerable, make him human, and deconstruct him. And it all started with the one man who knows how to deconstruct a superhero. And that was in 1986, an iconic year for comic books, right after the Crisis on Infinite Earth. And that, of course, was Alan Moore's Superman story, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. I finally got an opportunity to read this. Now, granted, Superman may not be my favorite superhero, but I will definitely say that I have read some incredible Superman stories. And yes, they all pretty much were stories that came out from the last 30, 40 years. Also, a very interesting thing about the 1980s, that was really a point in time when comics were starting to show a serious continuity. Like, we were really starting to see connecting stories. And we can thank Chris Claremont for that when he officially came on and started writing the X-Men. That was basically where it all started, where the comic book industry was realizing we need to go down this route. So Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow is such a unique story from Alan Moore because of how the story is told. It's told in flashbacks. It's told through the eyes of people who knew Superman as Clark Kent and people who knew Superman as Kal-El. But what was also very interesting was to see just how vulnerable Superman was. I think one of the most important parts of that whole deconstruction is the pages where you actually see Superman crying. Like, in America at the time, it was like men crying is a very demeaning thing to see. But through this story, we really got to see the humanity in this character and the vulnerability. So, like, even though he may be bulletproof, there is still a way that you can get this person to be vulnerable without the fantastic ways that are done, like through things like kryptonite.
And I was just going to say, that's the thing. It became a time when you could start to see people experimenting, and you're very right, with the idea of this is not a character that's about there's kryptonite in front of him, he can't beat the bad guy, we find a way to get the kryptonite away from him, now we can beat the bad guy because he's undefeatable. It goes into the man of Superman, which is, and this goes back to, Steve, what I was saying about how I think that the common take on what Superman is amongst people who are not diehard comic fans might have never gotten past 86, because that's really kind of where this other version of the character came into being that is now the prevailing version. That being said, there's something else that I'm sure we're going to talk about, which is there's kind of an easier way to write a Superman story that makes him not boring, that I think people have gone to the well of a few too many times now, which is the Superman as a fascist villain story, which, can be done really well. And I've enjoyed and discussed on this channel how much I have enjoyed some of those stories. But it's a little bit of a cheat code to writing a good Superman story. I think what we see in 86 and what people started to become comfortable writing, and some of the best Superman stories then do, is it's the humanity behind the character. It's not whether or not he can physically defeat the villain. It's about if he can be this man out of this world, if he can. It's funny, we talk about Alan Moore. You see so much of Superman in Dr. Manhattan, right? The idea of someone who is all powerful, but it makes them othered. And I think those stories of Superman are far more interesting.
Yeah, you see that in character. You see that in characters like Dr. Manhattan, and of course, another iconic piece that Alan Moore wrote. I mean, you want to talk about deconstructing a superhero. I mean, if you think Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, is a great story about deconstructing a superhero, you got to take a look at his work on Miracle Man. That is the best deconstruction of a superhero that I have ever seen. Not to say that Watchmen is bad. Believe me, as crazy of a kook as Alan Moore can be, I cannot deny that the man knows how to capture his audience. I mean, I'm still saying right now, I think Miracle Man is the greatest comic book that I've ever read. And you
Dude,
can
he's crazy.
definitely,
He's
and you can
crazy.
definitely see that there's so much inspiration from Superman in there. But what's very interesting is actually Miracle Man was actually the inspiration for Miracle Man, originally called Marvel Man, was actually Shazam, which is actually very interesting. But that's another thing that makes Superman such an interesting character, and that's the supporting cast. And I think that's also at the time in the 1980s, that was when we really started to see a better understanding of how Superman plays with others. I mean, you mostly saw, you knew that he, had the relationship with Lois and, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen and even Crypto the Superdog. But you think about the stories that really show his relationship with his parents and the relationships that he has with all the other superheroes and how distinctly different they are. His relationship with Wonder Woman is extremely different from his relationship with Batman. And I also love how there are certain times where I think one of the most interesting things is Dick Grayson in Darwin Cook's New Frontier. I love when Dick Grayson meets Superman for the first time in the comics and how even though he's Batman's sidekick, he is just in awe that not only is Superman in his presence, but the fact that his mentor is friends with Superman. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Yeah, it's the same reason I love the well, I love the Shazam movie. But I love the Sting. Just the idea of friends with Superman being like the calling card that all little kids would strive would strive to be awed by. But I think you're right, talking about the cast of characters that support him and why that's important. And I think the best Superman stories are ones that it's very easy to imagine how you could be like, all right, he's bulletproof. And so the way you get to him is through his loved ones. So we kidnap his loved ones. We put kryptonite next to him so he can't save them. He gets away from the kryptonite. He saves his loved ones. That's that boring story. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the interesting thing about Superman being his relationships with these people and not necessarily the physical peril to them, but his own connections with them and navigating those relationships while being someone who is othered is really the thing that's most interesting in the stories that we love. And I mean, it could be a great time to talk about a couple examples because what I'm saying right now makes me think of the Lois and Clark comics.
Well, yeah. But there's just one other thing that I want to touch on before
that's
that.
a little further in the future, I know.
I think when it comes to Superman and what makes him such a special character is the fact that in recent years, one of the things that the creators behind him really touched upon was his humanity. And we see stories that are basically as different as night and day when it comes to the concept of Superman dying. And that is the death of Superman, which was a gargantuan story. You have the death of Superman, you have Funeral for a Friend, and then you have the reign of the Superman. And of course, eventually you would get Superman's ultimate return. And this, of course, is a story where Superman is basically doing what Superman does, and it's basically him just going toe-to-toe with Doomsday and losing. But then you get a story like Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman, where he actually finds out that he is dying of cancer because of his exposure to the yellow sun. And so, first to think of the concept that not even Superman can be cancer. That's an interesting concept in its entirety. But the most amazing thing about All-Star Superman is the fact that it's not an action-packed story, and it's about him trying to find the best way to spend the last of his days. I mean, the death of Superman will always be iconic because it was the very first time that Superman was quote-unquote killed, and even though we're not sure if he's dead or if he died and whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow, but we know that in the death of Superman, we see it happen in issue number 75. But even though that was such an iconic time, it's amazing how that story has not really stood the test of time. And then when you take a look at comics history, that story was basically done for the purposes of trying to keep pace with the new kid on the block, which was Image Comics. Because when you found out that there was going to be 7 of these powerhouse comic book creators in one place, what do you do to compete? Because you've dropped to number 3 when you've been at number 2 this whole time against Marvel. You break Batman's back, you kill Superman. And that's why I feel that a story like The Death of Superman, while it is fun to read, I will not deny the fact that Dan Jurgens knew what he was doing. You know, he knew what he was doing. But and eventually it would spawn into a different story, which I'd love to talk about with you and others at some other point in time. But I feel that the story really hasn't stood the test of time as opposed to a much more smaller story like All-Star Superman.
Yeah, I can see that. Worth mentioning, I did, at least at the time, enjoy the animated adaptation of The Death of Superman, though. So that was predates most of the DC animated universe stuff that I know we talk about a decent amount, but still. But you can see why you can exactly. It's done at that time to kind of try to keep pace with Image, which would have been very scary to DC at the time. But again, it's just another example of one of those ways that they were doing something with the character. So while it's maybe not looked back on as a best of story, it's certainly looked back on as an iconic story.
Well, then, of course, we come to the time past the 90s and past the death of Superman. And Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman is definitely past that. But that's also when we get some of the best writers taking on this character. I mean, not to say that Alan Moore was not one of the best. He was one of the best. Another great take on the character in some shape or form, because another very interesting thing about Superman is when you focus on his humanity, it's a great story. But when you take away his humanity completely, what do you get? Well, you get stories like Kingdom Come. You get stories like Superman Red Sun. You get stories like Injustice, Gods Among Us. You get some even more interesting stories because it's like Superman's a fascist dictator. Superman's a cold-blooded killer. Like, wow, this is the time when you actually realize that Superman is not just the infamous big blue Boy Scout that can't be stopped. You know, he's not necessarily the unstoppable force. You can really take the characteristics of this character and mold them into so many different directions that you can. And there aren't that many characters that you could do that with. And yet Superman, as connect the dots as he can be, you really can go in so many different directions with him. So you want to focus on some of these stories I just mentioned? Please do.
Yeah, he can be your blank slate in a way by being able to be conceived of as so flawless. It allows you to break him down easily. It allows you to put your own spin on him pretty simply. If you want to start from a pop culture blank slate of, you know, the Man of Tomorrow, the Strong, but if you want to hear us talk at length about Kingdom Come, you know, feel free to do that. We have a video up. We also have a video on Red Sun.
Yeah,
do we have a video of Injustice? Did we talk about Injustice too?
We did, but yeah, that shows you guys how long it's been since we've actually taken a look at our archives. No, we did.
I know we've done Kingdom Come and Red Sun. Did we do Injustice?
We did do Kingdom Come, but that was just a comic on its own. And believe me, when it comes to DC animation, I am waiting for a Kingdom Come film. And we did do a comparison of Superman Red Sun and Injustice to their respective animated
That's
films.
what it was. It was the comparison.
Great discussions regardless.
Yeah, but now I just remembered the Injustice animated movie exists. So
and how much we hated it.
That's I was gonna say. I really lost on this interaction with that memory.
I will say, you know, Tom Taylor, while he can be very controversial at the moment, I think he really can be a good writer if he just has
Hmm.
the time and the space given to write great stories. And
Yeah.
Injustice, I think you can agree. You were the one that basically said to me, it went a little, it overstayed its welcome just a teensy bit.
Yeah, that's really what it is. And not to get too in depth with any particular story on this conversation that's more bird's eye than that. But at the same time, I think I did mention earlier about kind of how I felt one of the kind of cheat codes to writing a Superman story is to do Superman as the villain, to do the Superman who gives in to what his powers can be, who either, thinks the way forward is to be the be all and end all, the fascist Superman character, right? And I love a lot of those stories. And Injustice is a key one of them for me. Again, it kind of overstays its welcome, which I think might go to show you the limitations on writing a Superman like that, but can make for a great kind of one-off story. Yeah.
And then, it's also interesting to see another thing that made Superman stand the test of time, and it wasn't necessarily in the comics. I know that we mentioned the movies, but if there was one person that really knew what he was doing when it came to bringing Superman to a whole new generation, even if they weren't reading the comics, you got to give that credit to Bruce Timm.
Hmm.
Superman the Animated Series
Yeah.
is such an incredible show, and
Yeah.
I'm a perfect example because yes, I've known who Superman is all my life, but I never
Yeah.
truly was interested in going deeper rather than just like knowing who he is and everything that he's all about in general pop culture. But when Bruce Timm made Superman the Animated Series, I learned so much
Hmm.
about the character himself. I finally realized, oh my God, he has a rogues gallery. There
Yeah.
hasn't been a single person out there that was ever able to get past Lex Luthor when it comes to Superman's villains. And what I love so much is that Superman's villains can either be just plain old knucklehead fighters and monsters like Parasite, or even the ones that Bruce Timm created, like Livewire. But then you get these unusual characters like Mr. Mxyzptlk, who
Hmm.
is to me one of my favorite villains that Superman has because because you want to know why? Andy, you know the answer to this question. Who's my favorite Batman villain?
Actually, do I know the answer to this question?
You should, because I've mentioned it so many times in videos that you were actually a part of. My favorite Batman villain is the Riddler.
Okay.
And the reason why I love him so much is because his main goal is to outsmart Batman.
Yeah.
Well, what does
Yeah.
Mr. Mxyzptlk want to do? He wants to outsmart Superman.
Yeah. It's funny. I think, you're so right. And Bruce Timm did so much for the character. Bruce Timm did so much for me. I'm glad we're talking a little bit about this. It's weird that coming into this conversation, it was like not on my mind that we talk about the animated series. I also love Brainiac.
Yeah,
I
Brainiac is
mean,
a great
like,
character.
yeah, yeah. And of course, I will say, yeah, he's got a rogues gallery. Yes, we finally got past Lex Luthor, but not for nothing, a great version of the Lex Luthor character as well.
Oh, Clancy
Um,
Brown is the iconic. I know there's so many people that love Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor. I mean,
yeah.
even though I'm not a fan of Superman Returns, I love Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor. And I
Mhm.
gotta admit, I didn't have an issue with Jesse Eisenberg in Batman v Superman. And I have my reasons for that. But no one was a better Lex Luthor than Clancy Brown. The
Yeah,
voice is
yeah,
everything.
yeah.
And also, a great villain that Superman has, of course, is Darkseid. The
Right.
whole season that brought us Jack Kirby's Fourth World, the New Gods. That's a solid piece of DC lore that I truthfully love so dearly. And I know you're not the biggest fan of Zack Snyder's Justice League, but oh man, if he was able to stick around knowing what he could have done with the New Gods and Fourth World, I would have been on board for that because I loved that version. I just loved seeing a live action version of Darkseid in a
Yeah,
movie. I did.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, Jesse Eisenberg isn't the worst Lex Luthor. That's about all I have to say on the Zack Snyder
I
verse.
mean, and
Um,
another thing that I love about Bruce Timm, especially when it comes to Apocalypse. Oh God, the fact that he said to Ed
Apocalypse, yeah.
Asner, "You're going to voice Granny Goodness." To me, that is one of the greatest casting choices,
Casting in all
next to
time.
getting Clancy Brown as Lex Luthor, or even getting Gilbert Gottfried to voice Mr. Mxyzptlk. Like such a great idea and a casting choice. I love that version of Granny Goodness. I really do. And I
Yeah.
never would have known who Granny Goodness or the female Furies were if it wasn't for Bruce Timm.
And
That's the thing, everybody. Bruce Timm is one of my idols, and
yeah.
he is one of the driving forces that I know so much more about DC than I ever did.
Yeah, yeah, no, same. And I will say that I mean, credit Bruce Timm entirely with the prevalence of what DC animation has become. I mean, obviously, we've talked about the Batman animated series on this channel, but there's no expanded DC animated universe without the Superman animated series. It expanded so much on what DC could do on the screen, introduce people to characters, and it was used as an avenue to again introduce tangentially related Superman characters to extended DC universe characters to a young audience. We could and probably should do an entire episode about the Superman animated series at some point.
Well, you know what? We could always do what we did with Batman the Animated Series, and we could give our top 3 episodes. I
Top
mean,
episodes.
I don't know how quickly you'd want to do that. I mean, we could wait until 2026 and celebrate the anniversary of the show,
Yeah, I was just
but who
yeah,
knows
okay,
where
we'll
we're
talk
going to
about
be at
that one
that time.
offline. We'll talk about that one offline. I'll stop Googling stuff, but
Yeah, for
we need
sure,
to
for
make sure we
sure.
do more Superman
Yeah.
animated series on this
But
channel.
it's also very interesting because when you take a look at the longevity of the character, and it's also really funny because I know that you're not really following comic book news as much as I am right now. And it's amazing to see where some people feel the comic industry is right now,
Hmm.
and how some of the most beloved characters right now, nobody has any interest in reading them right now because their stories just aren't good.
Hmm.
So it's easy for a character like Superman to have gotten to that point, considering how long he had been around. When you take a look at characters like Spider-Man and the X-Men who have only been around half the time,
Yeah.
there was a point in time when DC Comics said, you know something, we've got to do something to reinvigorate this character. And of course, it wasn't just him, it was all of them. And that was when the New 52 came out in the
Hmm.
2000s after Flashpoint.
Hmm.
And I think this may have been the very first time where the comic book fandom just got up on their soapboxes and said, "What did you do to Superman?
Hmm.
You got him to be a little bit more youthful, but it's amazing to know how many people truly love the Big Blue Boy Scout, because the
Hmm.
New 52 Superman was brash, he was reckless. Nobody liked this version of Superman. And there were a lot of characters in the New 52 that were changed, and a lot of people really did not like where the New 52 went. Now, I personally have read some New 52 comics, and I will definitely say that there are some good ones, but that's also merely about the fact that those storylines were not changed, like, except for, I mean, Scott Snyder's Batman run, definitely, I think he took it to new levels, especially with the Joker. But I also think the weakness with the Batman New 52 story was the fact that it was way too Joker centric. Though I will
Hmm.
definitely say there was no scarier version of the Joker than the Death of the Family Joker. I will definitely say that right off the bat. And of course, the Green Lantern was continuing on with what Jeff Johns was doing with the character before then, and then passing the torch on to Robert Venditti, who also did a phenomenal job with Green Lantern, going all the way into DC Rebirth. But Superman was in a very bad place. I mean, people didn't even like the fact that he even changed the costume, where he was just like in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt at one point in time. But it's amazing to know that eventually the right writers at the right time would take on this character and actually say, no, we can fix this. Enter the era of Peter Tomasi and Dan Jurgens, and let me just tell you, it didn't last long enough, but that was when we got a brand new part of Superman's legacy, and we got introduced to John Kent, his son, through what may, in my opinion, be one of my favorite Superman stories of all time, and that, of course, is Superman, Lois and Clark.
Yeah, and here was me, as you were speaking, flipping through, trying to see, realizing to myself, have I read a single damn 52 comic? It was like letting you go as long as you possibly could, filling the time, because I was like, I'm not going to have much to say. But here we are on Lois and Clark. And yes, so this is the exact kind of exemplar tale of what I was talking about before, about writing the character as Superman as a man and the relationships he has being the driving force behind the story. Obviously, the introduction of John Kent is important for a lot of reasons, but within this story in particular, his existence as at first a vulnerability, and later an asset, as you know, as we continue to write the character. I loved that book. And it was, I wouldn't say, I mean, look, I've always been a Superman fan. I'd always say I'd been a Superman fan, but when you recommended that book to me, Steve, I didn't know how much I would like it. And I was very pleasantly surprised by the depth of emotion in that story.
Very, very heartwarming and very, very charming.
Yes, it is a true Superman story. But it is the best kind of Superman story. It's the fully human, fully hero story.
You're absolutely right. I think that John Kent was such a great addition at the time, because he was just like Winnie the Pooh. He was pure innocence. Pure innocence, full of imagination and wonder, and oh, if he only knew who his father was. You know, that was the most, but I think what the most amazing thing about this is, I personally never would have expected Superman to actually hide his identity from his son.
Yeah.
You know, I always felt that Superman, you know, maybe this is me thinking about him being the big blue Boy Scout, you know, I thought that he would tell him exactly who he was and that we got to keep it secret, but I never would have imagined that Clark would literally keep it from him entirely and have John discover it for himself.
Yeah, and it feels very natural when it's done also. So beyond being the opportunity to write a great story, and it really was a great story, it actually does feel very natural, because you can see it's like that Boy Scout feeling. You spare the people around you certain things, and also it reveals a little bit of Superman's character. He wants to just be the man for as long as he can be. And these are things that are really explored in the story, and I really credit it for that. The depth that it can get into in a relatively short length of time.
Yeah, and it's just amazing that what that story actually not only did was give us a great story in general, but it pretty much saved the New 52 version of Superman at the end, because the story that comes right after that is the ending of the Superman run in the New 52, and it's the last days of Superman.
Yeah.
It's an amazing story about how the two Supermen actually meet.
Right.
And how Superman #1 explains to Superman 52 why he's here and that he's not here to take anything from him, but the Superman from the New 52 knows that his world is dying and he's got to make a choice. And the fact that he sacrifices himself shows us that at the end of the day, even though this was an all new, all different Superman at the end of the day, it's still Superman.
Still Superman.
Yeah, and then, we get the Rebirth era and we get the Super Sons comics, and oh my goodness, I haven't read them yet, but I have heard so many great things about Tomasi's Super Sons run with John Kent and Damian Wayne. I mean, that's such an odd combination, but it's amazing how it works so well.
Yeah, I haven't read that myself. I have read some of Superman in the Rebirth era. It's funny. I was sitting here like, what New 52 have I read? And I'm like, Lois and Clark, I don't think of because it's good. But
yeah,
but
yeah, and and then Superman Reborn is such an interesting story. It's just such a clever piece of writing of how they can find a way to make the New 52 Superman return and actually give him one last more piece of significance in story writing. I mean, the truth of the matter is I really need to read that story again because it is such an unusual story, and yet it's just so brilliant. The whole stories that follow, that start off, and how it gets into Superman Reborn, when you get stories like Back to the Planet and A Man Named Clark Kent and Multiplicity, like all of these crazy stories that lead to this. And of course, it's also really funny how it's actually Mr. Mxyzptlk who's at the crux of this whole thing. Kind of love the fact that they also gave that character a whole new dimension. I use that word liberally, but it's such a great thing. And then it's just unfortunate that Rebirth started at such a great place and then only to just get rid of everything that was good where all of these stories were going and to just drag everything down. I mean, I have nothing good to say about what Brian Michael Bendis did for Superman because I chose not to read it.
Yeah.
But that was basically, pandemic Superman. And from what I've heard, Brian Michael Bendis destroyed the character.
Yeah.
And it's just really, really sad to know that it happened, but also sad to know that it was freaking Brian Michael Bendis who did it, considering all the great work that he's done. I mean, I say the same things about other writers like Jason Aaron. Like, everybody has nothing good to say about what he did to the Avengers run. Everybody hates his Avengers run. And you say Jason Aaron had some good work. I mean, it's crazy to know how certain artists can get to that kind of fall from grace. But even going a little further before the New 52, people like Jeff Johns, who truly loves the characters, can reinvigorate Superman storytelling just by using some of the old stuff that Superman has, like Up and Away is such a great story because it's basically Superman after Infinite Crisis living his life without powers. And how is he living his life without his powers, and what does he do when he gains them back? I've also read Superman Secret Origins by Jeff Johns, a whole reinvention of the Superman origin story. It's a little bit more modern, but he doesn't stray away from the things that make Superman Superman. And I appreciate Jeff Johns for that. But even today, we're in a very unusual place when it comes to Superman, even though, what has happened in the last 10 years is just mind-boggling. I mean, you have Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. Now, there are some people that don't care for Zack Snyder as a filmmaker, but then there are people like myself who thinks that Man of Steel is probably one of the greatest Superman films of all time. And the reason why I say that is because Superman actually throws a punch at somebody and actually has a big action sequence. I've said this to so many people, and if you never knew this, I'll tell this to you now. I don't like Richard Donner's Superman movie. I don't. Because I just feel that even though it's got all those amazing, iconic things that make Superman Superman, Superman does not have a fight. In Bruce Timm's Superman, episodes, he fights in
Mhm.
Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. He fights all these villains. He punches, he throws, he causes serious damage. That's Superman in the comics to a certain degree too.
Mhm.
So when you saw that big battle between Superman and Zod in the sky in Metropolis, and they're like crashing into buildings, and you had that epic Hans Zimmer score, I'm like, that is my Superman. But
Mhm.
apparently, not everybody likes that version of Superman.
No, no, but I definitely see the charm in it, though. I don't think we've talked about that movie at length on this channel because I know we talked about Justice League, but I think we didn't talk about the broader Snyderverse. But I myself am not a fan of the movie. We don't need to go super into it, but like what I will say is that there is a charm to that the action set pieces are a ton of fun, which is what they need to be. And I think that's an important part of kind of the action behind the character. I would use this as a segue though, while we're still kind of dabbling with the 2000s and also talking about Superman outside of comics and on the screen. I don't recall us talking about this, but now's as good a time as any to mention Smallville, which I love actually.
I didn't
Um,
watch it past the first 4 episodes.
yeah, I love Smallville, and actually, Marissa, my wife, watched it not all that long ago. I guess it was probably during the pandemic. It was all on Hulu, so she watched it too. But that was a big one for me, and I bring it up because talking about how much I love stories about Superman the man. That was the point of Smallville to show it before Clark is Superman, and you can do stories with that. Anyway, we don't need to go into that in depth, but while we talk about Superman outside of the comics themselves, this is the episode where it's appropriate for me to mention that I love Smallville.
There's
Um,
nothing wrong with that. I mean, look,
yeah,
next to Clancy Brown, I would probably say that Michael Rosenbaum was a great Lex Luthor.
I absolutely love him as Lex Luthor. I think he's phenomenal in the series.
Hey, I mean, look, I even for a little bit, I even watched the short-lived CW Supergirl. I thought Melissa
Hmm.
Benoist was a great Supergirl. I
Yeah.
don't really know too much about that version of Superman that they have there. It was great to see him, by the way, but
Hmm.
it is what it is. I mean, the thing about Superman is there's so many different versions of him,
Yeah.
and there's a little something there for everybody. And I don't really know what's going to happen with Superman going on to year 90, but right now I'm not reading any of the Superman comics. I mean, Philip Kennedy Johnson is still writing Action Comics, and I liked his War World saga. I thought it was
Hmm.
very good. It was very interesting to see Superman take the reins in a different way and not really be there to help Earth. And that's also the other interesting thing because this was also when we got Superman, Son of Kal-El from Tom Taylor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, that book got a ton of flack. It really, really did. But I
I loved it. You know,
personally,
I loved it. Yeah.
well, look, I read all 18 issues and I really
Yeah. Same.
appreciated it. Look, I know the elephant in the room there, and my God, it is a big elephant. You could probably get ivory from that elephant to fill a swimming pool, but an Olympic sized swimming pool for that matter. But I mean, like, people never gave that story a chance.
They
And I
didn't.
think it's just
And it,
because of the fact that nobody wanted to give it a chance. And all it really was the son of Superman being told, you have to take care of the earth while I'm away, son. And it's really about this teenage Superman trying to realize my dad gave me this responsibility to take care of the planet Earth. So how do I do it? Do I
mm,
do it exactly the way he does it? Do I do something the way I want to do it? And on top of that, it's also him going through his life. Like he's in college right now. He's
mhm,
meeting people, because he's not an alien. He's got
mhm.
alien DNA in there, but he's also human.
He's of this earth. He is not othered in the way that Clark is. And
Yeah,
I think that you're exactly right. The thing it's a deconstruction of the Superman character. I know it's not Clark Kent, but it's the same idea. Just by questioning, hey, I'm another Superman, and I've been charged with taking care of the Earth. Will I do it the same way? therein lies a deconstruction in and of itself. And the fact that seeing someone else with the same responsibilities and the same powers would not be Clark. But nevertheless, it's a really great story, focuses on who he is. I think very, very highly of that book. I also read the whole thing. So
Yeah, and I
do
mean,
with
right
that what you
now
will.
there's a brand new Superman series right now being written by Joshua Williamson, and
Yeah,
I mean Joshua Williamson is a great writer, but I keep saying the same thing about him right now. The problem is he is a great writer, but the problem is DC is really giving him way too many
strapped.
projects, and I
Yeah,
just feel that he's not really able to give us everything that he can, that he's truly capable of when he's just got so much on his plate. Meanwhile,
yeah,
you've got Mark Waid writing Batman Superman World's Finest, and that is one of the most fun, entertaining comics that I've read with Superman and Batman in it. It's going on the finishing up of his third story arc. And what I love so much about that comic is not just the fact that you get Superman and Batman the way you want to get Superman and Batman in the comics, but it's just unbelievable that Mark Waid is just going deep into the DC lore and pulling out all of these characters for some of these stories. You're not even going to believe which characters showed up in the current story arc that I'm reading right now. It's about to get to the end, but we're seeing characters like Metamorpho
mhm.
and the Metal Men. I mean, when was the last time the Metal Men were in a comic book that everybody was reading?
If the one takeaway from this episode is that I finally get around to reading some World's Finest beyond the 2 issues that I bought when it first started, this will be a very worthwhile conversation.
Well, I will let you know that there was a new comic that just came out this week, and it is in the vein of World's Finest. It's also being written by Mark Waid. It's a
Okay, yeah.
six-issue miniseries, World's Finest Teen Titans.
Yeah, hell yeah. I
I
mean,
already read the
yeah.
first issue. Oh my God, it was so much fun. I love Mark Waid. He is doing such amazing things. But, you know, right now, there is a new Superman mini series that is out right now, and that is being written by Christopher Priest, which is called Superman Lost. And
Mhm.
I don't really know what to make of it, but I will definitely say that you've never read a Superman story like this. It is so different and so unique. But when it comes to unique Superman stories, sometimes they're not even about Superman.
Mhm.
And I am so glad that I was recommended this. I read Kurt Busiek's Secret Identity. That is such a great idea. Have you read it yet?
No, no.
Well, Kurt Busiek, I mean, how could you not? You know the name. I mean,
Mhm.
Astro City, one of the
Mhm.
best writers in comic books from the 90s. The story of Secret Identity is about our world and a boy who was born in the Midwest, not in Smallville, Kansas, but in Kansas, and his name just happens to be Clark Kent. His parents named him Clark because their last name was Kent, and they're all big Superman fans, so they named him Clark. And everybody basically gives him Superman themed gifts for the holidays and his birthday. They mention pop culture references around him, and Clark just hates Superman. He hates Superman with a passion because he hates the fact that he's always being connected to this fictional character. And out of nowhere, one day, he doesn't know how, but he develops Superman's powers.
Mhm.
So it's now up to him to decide what is he going to do with these powers.
That's a
I
good
will say
elevator
that
pitch
it is,
too.
yeah, I will say it is all the Superman stories that we talked about, good, bad, or indifferent. To me, I feel that they all culminate in Secret Identity. The humanity, the inhumanity, the choices, the attitude, how does someone who has known about this fictional character for so long all of a sudden develops these powers? What do I do? How
Mhm.
do I live my life? And you see how he does it. You see the encounters that he has, the relationships that he forges, and some of the other big surprises along the way. It's only 4 issues. I highly recommend this. And truthfully, I would say to people that if I were to recommend you a Superman comic, this is the one that I would recommend you because it's not in continuity and it is the perfect story for someone on the outside looking into the world of Superman. Because that's exactly what Secret Identity is about. It's about someone from the outside looking in. It's great.
I think that's really great. And I also think, well, first off, I'll get to it, but it's a shame I don't know these 2 stories we're talking about right now, because I think it's really interesting that exemplars of great takes on the character. We're talking about Secret Identity, which from the sound of it is this kind of classic deconstruction by it being a different Superman, different person with the powers, need to learn what that means. And then on the other side of the coin is we're sitting here talking about World's Finest, which the whole idea of World's Finest is that you're getting that classic Batman Superman team up. And I think it's really telling that there are great stories to be told in both takes. It doesn't need to be you do something crazy and new with Superman. You can do something fun, you can do something classic, or there's always new avenues that you can explore, even 85 years in. Though I think Secret Identity is like mid 2000s, I think.
It's
But anyway,
2004, I believe.
oh no, 70 years in. Oh God, wait, that's longer ago than I think it is. Don't make me feel old. But yeah, it still modern takes on the character, that there is still room for unique stories and new stories that can be told with one of the oldest characters out there.
Yeah. I mean, what else can we possibly say? I mean, look, I don't know what the future holds for this character. I mean, right now, all I know is that the 2 things that are out there and remaining in mystery right now is the fact that there's apparently another Superman event on the way, and apparently it's going to involve Doomsday, so I'm going to check that out when it comes. Curious to see who's going to be writing it. And of course, the big one is James Gunn's new Superman movie. You know? I
Yeah.
mean, I honestly am starting to feel like one of those people that is all superheroed out when it comes to movies. So Spider-Man Beyond the Spider-Verse, please get here as soon as possible because I need something good. And now there's a brand new Superman cartoon on TV right now called My Adventures with Superman. I believe I can actually check it out on Max at the moment, so I'm going to check it out.
Oh, nice.
And now there's even going to be DC anime coming out in print in September, and one of them is going to be a Superman book. So, Superman lives on in so many different ways, and I'm personally excited to see what's next, but I will definitely say if it wasn't for my reinvigoration of comic books and really getting to dive into some of these great stories from the last 30, 40 years, I don't think I would be as big of a Superman fan as I am. I mean, like, look, I had Kingdom Come in my possession since I was 14 years old. But I never would have imagined what it would become in regards to iconic stories. I mean, hell, I just bought that book when I was 14 because I loved Alex Ross's drawings. I mean, that's the only reason why I bought the book. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that I feel the same way. While I would never say that Superman is one of my absolute favorite heroes, to go back to where I started, I think that he is in the DNA of American pop culture. I think that he is one of, if not the most important superheroes. And really it's that American mythology. It's that this is the modern day Moses. This is the story. This is the campfire story. This is the thing that's mythology for the modern day. And so there will always be a place for the Superman character. That doesn't mean to say that you can't write great stories with him. That doesn't mean to say that you can't do interesting things, break the character down, reinvestigate what makes Clark Kent tick, use characters that are not Clark Kent to be Superman. We've talked about those examples too. But I think that ending where we began, the most important thing about the character that's going to have this character last another 85 years, certainly to 100, but 85 beyond, is that being in the DNA of pop culture. I think you will always have people who know it's a bird, it's a plane. And I think that there's something really special about that.
85 years and still going strong, ladies and gentlemen. That's Superman in a nutshell. So I think that that's going to wrap it up. Andy, let me just say that it was so great to actually sit down and have a great comic book discussion with you for the first time in a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really hoping that this is just a taste of what is yet to come over here on the channel. Guys, I
Same.
know it's been a while. I know that you haven't seen us in a while, but look, life is complicated for good, for bad, indifferent, whatever you say. But I promise you, there will be content. You know, we started off very, very strong in early 2023, and then just things were starting to happen left and right, not just on Andy's end. Lots of stuff has been going on my end too. But look, we're still reading, we're still loving
Yeah.
what we're reading, and we want to bring more content to you. So for now, just take it as it comes, and we will see you in the next one.
Thanks so much, everybody. Looking forward to it, Steve.